Berlin, February 1945. The night sky was not black anymore. It was orange. Layers of smoke rolled above the ruined capital like torn cloth, swallowing the stars. In the basement of the Air Defense Ministry, German officers sat around a map lit by a trembling bulb. The walls shook once, then fell silent. Someone exhaled. Cigarettes flared. The air smelled of dust and sweat. One officer muttered, "It's over." For a moment, everyone believed him. The rumble overhead was fading, replaced by the faint crackle of burning buildings. Radios hissed. The young aide at the teleprinter relaxed his hands. Then, a low, distant sound. At first, like thunder beyond the clouds. Then deeper, rhythmic, familiar. Engines. Hundreds of them. The silence they had waited for never came back. As the tables rattled and the map pins danced across Europe's ruined outline, the officers realized what every German city had already learned. When the bombers left, it only meant they were turning around. When the bombers came, it wasn't by chance. It was by design, built on years of industrial calculation and moral debate. In 1939, Germany had unleashed blitzkrieg on Europe. By 1940, the Luftwaffe ruled the skies, turning Warsaw, Rotterdam, and London into proof that air power could terrify entire nations. But what began as Germany's weapon of dominance would, within a few short years, become its undoing. The seeds of retribution were planted in Britain's darkest year, 1940. After the fall of France, Winston Churchill stood alone. The Luftwaffe bombed London nightly in what came to be called the Blitz, killing over 40,000 civilians. Entire streets vanished beneath walls of flame and debris. Yet Britain did not surrender. From that defiance grew a quiet, determined resolve inside the Royal Air Force. If Germany wanted to fight by air, the Allies would answer by fire. By 1942, the RAF's Bomber Command, under Air Chief Marshal Arthur Bomber Harris, had been reshaped into an instrument of total war. Its goal was no longer just to hit factories or railways. It was to break the German war machine by striking at the cities that fed it. Hamburg, Cologne, Essen. These were not just coordinates, but living, breathing industrial hearts. Harris believed that only by reducing them to rubble could the Third Reich's will be broken. The strategy was called area bombing. It was brutal, imprecise, and controversial even among Allied leaders. But it was effective. By concentrating hundreds of aircraft in a single raid, the RAF could create firestorms, self-feeding infernos that devoured oxygen and melted asphalt. Germany, confident behind its night fighter network and radar-guided flak guns, was unprepared for the scale that came next. In March 1943, the Allies launched the Battle of the Ruhr, a 5-month campaign aimed at the industrial valley that produced most of Germany's steel and armaments. The attacks came in waves: 273 aircraft over Essen, 348 over Dortmund, 600 over Duisburg. Factories burned. Rail lines buckled. Workers slept in tunnels beneath their own city streets, emerging at dawn to find nothing left but chimneys. Inside Luftwaffe command centers, officers tried to make sense of the chaos. Radar screens flickered like heartbeat monitors. Searchlights combed the clouds. Fighter pilots scrambled into the night, only to find themselves lost in blinding flares and smoke. Each raid that reached the Ruhr weakened not just production, but faith. Goebbels' propaganda machine could no longer hide the truth. Germany's skies were no longer safe. By July 1943, the RAF turned its attention north, to Hamburg, the proud port city on the River Elbe. The operation had a name that sounded almost polite: Gomorrah. But what unfolded between July 24th and August 3rd was closer to the end of the world. On the first night, 791 bombers struck. The second, 740 more. Temperatures on the ground rose to over 800 degrees. Asphalt boiled. People suffocated in air raid shelters as the flames consumed the oxygen. The firestorm was so intense that pilots reported their planes being lifted by thermal currents over 6,000 feet high. When the smoke cleared, 42,000 civilians were dead, and one of Germany's largest cities had ceased to exist. From that moment, the German High Command knew the war had changed. Hitler called it Terrorfliegerei, terror flying. Göring, once boasting that no enemy aircraft would ever fly over the Reich, now faced a sky filled with enemy wings every night. But this was only the beginning. Across the Channel, another force was forming, one that would bring daylight precision and relentless repetition. The U.S. 8th Air Force, arriving in Britain in 1942, promised to hit what the RAF could not see in the dark: Germany's factories, refineries, and oil fields. By combining Britain's night raids with America's daytime strikes, the Allies built a rhythm of destruction that no nation had ever faced, a cycle of fire and thunder that never truly stopped. And as Germany adjusted its defenses and civilians rebuilt what they could, the officers in their bunkers kept waiting for silence, a silence that was already extinct. If this story pulls you in, don't forget to subscribe, and tell us which country or city you're watching from in the comments. By late 1943, the air war over Europe had evolved into something the world had never seen before: an industrial-scale duel in the sky. Every day and night, thousands of men climbed into aircraft designed for one purpose: to erase cities. From airfields scattered across southern England, the U.S. 8th Air Force took off in perfect formation, sunlight glinting off endless rows of silver bombers, B-17 flying fortresses, and B-24 Liberators. They believed in precision, in daylight strikes, in the myth that bombs could cripple a war machine without touching the people who built it. But over Germany, theory met reality. The Luftwaffe had perfected a defense system unlike anything else in the world. Layers of radar stations stretched from the French coast to the heart of the Reich. Night fighters like the Bf-110 and Ju-88 prowled the darkness, guided by radio signals and radar screens glowing green in command bunkers. Thousands of flak 80mm guns, the same weapons that once tore Allied tanks apart in North Africa, now filled the sky with steel. Each night, those officers waited underground, headphones pressed to their ears, as spotters reported. Ein massiver Verband, heading northeast, altitude 6,000. Every flicker on the radar meant hundreds of lives converging toward one point on the map. Yet no matter how advanced Germany's defenses became, the Allies adapted faster. British scientists perfected window. Thin strips of aluminum foil dropped from bombers to blind radar. German operators stared at blank screens, unable to distinguish ghost signals from real formations. Meanwhile, the Americans introduced long-range escorts, the sleek P-51 Mustang, capable of flying deep into Germany and protecting the bombers all the way to Berlin and back. This single change shattered the Luftwaffe's final advantage. German fighters, once kings of their own skies, now found themselves hunted. By early 1944, the sky above Europe had become a second battlefield. On the ground, men died in trenches. Above, they died in flames. The Allies called their new rhythm round-the-clock bombing. By day, American bombers hammered industrial targets: ball-bearing factories in Schweinfurt, aircraft plants in Regensburg, synthetic fuel refineries in Leuna and Pölitz. By night, the RAF struck cities, spreading waves of fire that turned industrial zones into scorched wastelands. German morale, already weakened after Hamburg, began to crack. Cities like Leipzig, Kassel, and Darmstadt saw entire districts flattened. Railway junctions disappeared, bridges collapsed, and yet orders from Hitler remained the same: rebuild, resist, retaliate. In Berlin, propaganda minister Joseph Goebbels raged that the German spirit would outlast the bombers, but even he began to record doubts in his diary. Our enemies have the skies. The raids no longer come in waves. They are continuous. By the summer of 1944, the destruction reached a scale that even Allied commanders hadn't predicted. Over Germany's 60 largest cities, nearly 45% of housing was destroyed or damaged. Millions were homeless. Entire towns operated from basements and ruins. And still, the bombers came. Inside command bunkers, officers waited for gaps. For the moment the bombers would stop, for the engines to fade. But as soon as the last echoes of one raid died away, reconnaissance planes appeared overhead, marking the next targets with flares. Factories that rebuilt by day burned again by night. The rhythm became mechanical, merciless. By the end of 1944, even hardened German officers began to understand what this meant. They were no longer defending territory, they were defending time. Every night survived was just another night before the next raid. In December 1944, as snow fell over Berlin, General Hans Jaschonek, the Luftwaffe's chief of staff, summarized it bitterly. "The enemy no longer gives us time to breathe." He was right. For the men underground, clutching headphones, staring at maps, listening to distant thunder, silence was no longer peace. It was only the pause between bombardments, and by February 1945, as Berlin became the last target left standing, they realized something else. Even when there was no sound outside, the war above never stopped. When historians describe the Allied bombing campaign, they often talk in numbers: aircraft, tonnage, casualties. But behind every figure was a face, a trembling hand, or a heartbeat echoing through the hum of engines. To truly understand how the bombers came back every time, we must see it through all eyes, from the sky, the ground, and the command bunkers beneath the earth. Angle 1. The men in the sky for the bomber crews. Every mission felt like flying inside a clockwork death machine. The RAF Lancaster and the B-17 Flying Fortress were marvels of engineering, strong, cold, and mercilessly loud. Once inside, the world vanished into vibration and wind. Frost clung to oxygen masks, intercoms crackled with static. Each man had a role: pilot, navigator, bombardier, wireless operator, gunners. They trusted each other completely, and for good reason. Out of every 100 airmen in RAF Bomber Command, over 44 were killed, another 17 captured, and many more listed as missing. Their average life expectancy in 1943 was 6 missions. And yet, they climbed back in, night after night. They didn't speak of revenge or ideology. Most spoke of duty, rhythm, habit. The engine roar became their heartbeat, the dark sky their constant companion. They measured time by missions, not months. When they released their bombs, the city below turned into a living inferno. But the crews rarely saw what they had done. They saw only light, smoke, and anti-aircraft bursts. The flak flowers, as they called them, blooming in the night sky. To them, war was mechanical. But for those waiting below, it was personal. Angle 2. The civilians beneath the fire in German cities. Life was built around sirens. Families slept in clothes, with small bundles of food and papers ready. When the first wail sounded, they ran into basements, tunnels, or bunkers built from concrete thicker than walls of castles. Mothers carried infants under blankets to shield their eyes from the blinding flash bombs. Children counted seconds between the air raid alarm and the first explosion. In cities like Hamburg, Kassel, and Dresden, the heat grew so intense that people were lifted from the streets by the vacuum of firestorms, sucked into the flames. After each raid, survivors climbed out to find entire districts turned to dust. No sound but the creak of collapsing roofs and the hiss of embers. The next day they cleaned, buried, and waited. But it wasn't just physical destruction. It was psychological collapse. Letters recovered from Berliners spoke of exhaustion, disbelief, and anger at their own government's lies. They tell us victory is near, but the sky says otherwise. Still, many refused to surrender. National pride ran deep. The image of Germany as unbreakable endured even in ruin, and so they rebuilt what they could, only to watch it burn again the following week. Angle 3. The officers below ground in command bunkers beneath Berlin, Hanover, and Munich, Luftwaffe officers followed every raid in real time. They tracked incoming aircraft on radar screens glowing like constellations. They issued orders. Searchlights to Sector 14. Night fighters scramble. Flak batteries. Open fire. They waited for results that never came. By 1944, they knew the truth. Their air defenses were outnumbered, outmatched, and outdated. Fuel shortages crippled pilot training. Radar interference blinded operators. Yet Hitler demanded miracles. When the bombing paused, these officers would step outside, into the dark streets filled with ash. Some found their homes gone. Others found their families among the dead. And yet they returned to the bunkers because that's where the orders came from. They weren't villains. Most were professionals fighting an unwinnable war. They recorded losses, plotted next intercepts, and waited for the silence that meant survival. A silence that, as the months went by, came less and less often. One German colonel later wrote, "There was no night or day, only the hum of engines and the waiting between raids." Angle 4. The rhythm of fear. From the cockpit to the cellar, fear had its own language. For the Allied pilots, it was the ping of flak on the fuselage or the sudden flash of tracer fire ripping past the wing. For civilians, it was the distant rumble, the first warning that the bombers were coming back. And for the officers underground, fear was silence, because silence meant the bombers were regrouping for another wave. The rhythm of fear bound both sides together. The crews feared death from the sky they commanded. The people below feared life beneath it. Both prayed for the same thing, an end that never came. When the bombers returned night after night, it wasn't just courage that kept them in the sky. It was technology, discipline, and a moral conviction that what they were doing could end the war faster. But as the campaign intensified, the line between strategy and vengeance began to blur. Angle 5. The War of Machines and Signals. The skies over Europe became a vast laboratory of innovation. Each side raced to outthink the other, not with bullets, but with electrons. British engineers developed H-2S radar, allowing bombers to identify cities by their reflections on a glowing screen. For the first time, targets could be found through clouds or darkness. Germany responded with Naxos detectors to home in on H-2S signals and intercept them. Then came Window, the simplest yet most effective weapon of deception. Crews dumped thousands of thin aluminum strips into the air, creating clouds of false echoes on enemy radar. Command posts thought hundreds of aircraft were heading toward one city, while the real bombers slipped toward another. Soon, the air war became a contest of invisible waves. Allied bombers carried Monica tail-warning radars. German night fighters used SN2 receivers to track Monica's signals. Each countermeasure bred another. This was not just a fight of flesh and steel. It was a battle of frequency and pulse. The war in the sky had turned into a chess game played with lightning. Angle 6. The architects of strategy. Behind every operation was a mind that believed in numbers, not emotions. Air Chief Marshal Arthur Bomber Harris saw himself as a realist. He believed that the only way to end the war was to destroy Germany's capacity and will to fight. His motto was cold but clear. The Germans sowed the wind. Now they are going to reap the whirlwind. On the American side, General Carl Spaatz and Jimmy Doolittle championed precision bombing. Their faith lay in striking key industrial targets: oil, rail, aircraft production, believing that destroying these would cripple the Wehrmacht faster than terrorizing civilians. Yet, in practice, the skies didn't care about intentions. High-altitude bombing was never truly precise. Weather, wind, smoke, and anti-aircraft fire scattered bomb loads over entire neighborhoods. Every strategy looked clean on paper. Every mission looked brutal from below. Even within the Allied command, debates raged. Was this warfare or vengeance? Prime Minister Churchill himself later confessed that the bombing of German cities remained a question mark over our moral record. But to the men who flew the missions and the families who had endured the Blitz, it felt justified. For them, every German city burned was one less Allied city destroyed. Angle 7. The shadow of firestorms. The firestorm was not just a consequence, it became a phenomenon. When thousands of tons of high explosives and incendiaries landed within minutes, they created their own weather. Hurricane winds, oxygen-starved vacuums, temperatures hotter than molten steel. In Hamburg, The inferno reached 800 degrees Celsius. In Kassel, the air itself caught fire. In Darmstadt, the flames leapt from street to street faster than people could run. Firefighters could do nothing but watch. Even the Luftwaffe's own reports called these events Luftbrandkatastrophen, air fire catastrophes. Survivors described it as the end of the world. The sky glowed red for nights on end. Ash fell like snow hundreds of miles away. Entire families vanished, leaving no remains to identify. The firestorm changed how both sides saw war. To the Allies, it proved that air power could destroy a nation's ability to fight. To the Germans, it showed that courage alone could not stop industrial annihilation. Angle 8. The moral weight of victory. By 1945, the Allies had achieved total air dominance. But with victory came a question no bomb sight could answer. How far was too far? The raids on Dresden in February 1945 left one of Europe's most beautiful cities in ruins. Over 25,000 civilians died in a single night of flame. For many, it marked the moment when destruction surpassed necessity. German survivors described the raids not as battles, but as mass punishments. Allied crews, when interviewed years later, often struggled to justify what they had seen. Some said, "We were told it would end the war." Others whispered, "We just followed orders." The moral fog of total war left no side untouched. The technology that had given man the power to reach the sky had also given him the power to erase cities from maps. And as the winter of 1945 approached, even the most hardened officers realized the end would not come from surrender, but from exhaustion. By early 1945, Germany was a shadow of itself. From the air, the once proud Reich looked like a quilt of ruins. Rivers of ash, twisted steel, and cratered streets stretching to the horizon. But the bombers hadn't stopped. They were preparing for the final act, the destruction of Berlin, the heart of Nazi power. The operation had begun months earlier under a code name that sounded biblical, Thunderclap. The plan was to unleash concentrated waves of bombers upon key German cities, to crush resistance and break civilian morale ahead of the Red Army's advance. Berlin, Dresden, Leipzig, and Chemnitz were chosen as targets, not only for their factories and transport links, but for their symbolism. By February, the Allies controlled the skies completely. The Luftwaffe was nearly gone. Fuel shortages, lack of trained pilots, and the relentless Allied air offensive had reduced it to fragments. For every German fighter that took off, 3 more burned on the ground. Still, in the underground command posts of Berlin, officers clung to maps, headphones, and orders that no longer mattered. The night Berlin burned on. February 3, 1945, at precisely 11 a.m., 937 American B-17 flying fortresses from the 8th Air Force appeared above Berlin. The winter sky was clear, perfect visibility. Their orders: destroy the city's transport hubs, communications centers, and government districts. Each aircraft carried nearly 6,000 pounds of bombs. Within 30 minutes, over 2,500 tons of explosives rained down on the capital. The roar shook the foundations of the Reich Chancellery. The Tiergarten turned into a wasteland of burning trees and overturned trams. The Gestapo headquarters was hit. So was Goebbels' propaganda ministry, the Reichsbank, and several of Berlin's largest hospitals. The air defenses fired until the barrels of the 88mm guns glowed red, but the bombers flew higher than most shells could reach. When the raid ended, 2,800 people lay dead. Goebbels walked through the wreckage, muttering that the enemy has no heart. But in truth, Germany no longer had the means to fight back. The very next night, as survivors cleared debris and buried the dead, radar operators in Berlin detected a new signal, another wave of bombers crossing the Dutch coast. They thought it must be a mistake. It wasn't. It was the RAF, returning to finish what the daylight hadn't destroyed. The officers below ground, the same men who had waited for silence, now realized there would be no pause, no mercy. Every time they believed the storm had passed, the engines returned. The fire over Dresden. 1 week later, the city of Dresden became the next target. It was February 13, 1945, Shrove Tuesday. Tens of thousands of refugees had crowded into the Baroque city, fleeing the Soviet advance from the east. At 10:03 p.m., the first wave of 244 RAF Lancasters arrived. They dropped high explosives to blow off roofs and windows. 30 minutes later, a second wave came. 529 bombers, this time loaded with incendiaries. The wind did the rest. The flames merged into a single roaring vortex. Temperatures reached 1,000 degrees C. Asphalt melted. Church bells fused. The air itself ignited. Pilots flying above could see the inferno from 200 miles away, a red glow rising into the stratosphere. Those who survived underground said the oxygen was sucked from their shelters. People collapsed and never woke up. By morning, Dresden, once called the Florence of the Elbe, had vanished beneath smoke and rubble. The official death toll stood at 25,000, but some historians believe it may have been far higher. Even Allied commanders were shaken. Air Marshal Harris, when told of the devastation, said simply, "They have sown the wind." To the men who planned these raids, the destruction was a military necessity, an effort to end the war faster, to cripple transportation, and delay German reinforcements to the Eastern Front. But to those watching from the ground, it looked like apocalypse. The German view from below in Berlin. Reports from Dresden reached the capital within hours. Officers in the Air Defense Ministry read the telegrams in silence. They had seen Hamburg burn. They had watched Cologne flattened. But Dresden, that was different. It had been untouched. A city of culture, not war. If the Allies could destroy that, then nowhere was sacred. Goebbels raged in despair. They have destroyed what even our enemies once admired. But Hitler remained in denial. He ordered counterstrikes that never launched and promised secret weapons that no longer existed. By then, the sound of Allied engines had become a constant part of life. The sound of inevitability. For the officers underground, every vibration through the walls felt like a heartbeat counting down to the end of their world. The raids on Berlin and Dresden were not isolated events. They were the sound of Germany's collapse. By March 1945, the Reich had become a skeleton, its veins of railways and industry shattered, its lungs of fuel and oil strangled. But what truly broke its heart was the silence that never came. The endless return of engines, night after night, that told every German officer, soldier, and civilian, "It's over." The war beneath the ruins in Berlin's Flacktürme, colossal concrete towers that once symbolized the regime's confidence. Officers huddled around flickering maps. The towers, built to defend the capital, had become tombs of steel. Each tower had radar dishes, spotlights, and hundreds of anti-aircraft guns. They were meant to protect the city, but now they merely delayed destruction. Their gunners fired blindly into the sky, hitting nothing but the smoke they created. The 88mm flak cannons, once feared across the world, could no longer find their targets. The bombers were too many, too high, too relentless. When the first thunder faded, the officers inside would take off their headphones and listen. Always the same question. Is it over? Sometimes there would be 10 minutes of silence, sometimes 20. Then, faint at first, the low growl would rise again. The bombers are returning. That phrase became their nightmare refrain. The radio operators who once barked orders now whispered prayers. Maps became useless. Command posts shook as foundations cracked. There was no longer a front line. The front line was the air itself. The collapse of the Luftwaffe. By 1945, the Luftwaffe was a shadow, a force fighting ghosts. Its ace pilots were dead or grounded. Its fuel reserves were nearly empty. Many aircraft never left the hangar. The once proud symbol of Germany's military genius now existed mostly on paper. General Robert Ritter von Greim, one of the few remaining commanders, later recalled, "We had pilots who could not take off because there was no fuel, and others who took off knowing they would not return." The Allied air forces, meanwhile, grew stronger every week. American factories produced more aircraft in 1 month than Germany could repair in 3. The sky was no longer a battlefield. It was Allied territory. When American P-51 Mustangs began escorting bombers directly over Berlin, even German civilians could recognize the silhouette of the long-range fighters and whisper, "They've reached the capital." In the final months, Hitler's rage turned inward. He accused his own air marshals of betrayal, of cowardice, of failing to defend the Reich. But even he knew it was over. The sky, once promised to belong to Germany, was gone forever. Inside the command bunkers deep beneath Berlin, in rooms lined with concrete and dim bulbs, officers of the Reichsluftfahrtministerium, Air Ministry, recorded reports that no one would ever read. They marked every raid with precision. 02.14. Large formation approaching from the northwest. 02.32. Explosions in the Charlottenburg district. 02.47. Fires spreading to the government quarter. Each line, each timestamp, was another heartbeat of a dying nation. Many of these officers had served since the first days of the Blitz, when Germany had bombed London and boasted of domination. Now they listened to the same sound in reverse. British and American bombers circling above their capital, their families in the fire. They waited for silence. But when it came, they no longer believed it. Every still moment felt false, a prelude to another raid. They learned to fear calm as much as noise. The final raids on April 19, 1945. With Soviet forces already at the gates of Berlin, the RAF launched one of its last operations. Over 700 bombers crossed into German airspace that night. Their targets were already ruins, yet the missions continued, to choke remaining transport lines and deny the enemy any hope of regrouping. One German observer in the capital wrote, "The earth trembled all night. Even now, with the Russians only miles away, the bombers come as if to make sure there will be nothing left to capture." In the final days, fires burned across Berlin without interruption. Water lines were destroyed. Firefighters fought with shovels and buckets. Civilians moved underground permanently. And still, when dawn came, they heard it again. The steady hum of engines in the distance, growing louder by the hour. For the men in the bunkers there was nothing left to command. They simply listened. The sound of the end-on. May 2, 1945, the city surrendered. The streets were silent for the first time in years. Truly silent. No aircraft, no engines, no guns. Only smoke rising from the ruins of what had once been Europe's most powerful empire. The surviving officers stepped out from their bunkers, blinking into daylight, breathing air that still tasted of fire and dust. For the first time, there really was silence. But now it meant defeat. One of them reportedly whispered, "So this is what silence sounds like." The bombers had stopped, because there was nothing left to return to. When the echoes finally died, Germany was no longer a nation of cities. It was a nation of ruins. From Cologne to Königsberg, from Hamburg to Munich, the landscape looked like a single wound stretched across a continent. For years, the Allies had spoken of breaking the Reich's war machine. By May 1945, they had done more than that. They had broken its bones, its breath, its very rhythm of life. The numbers of destruction between 1940 and 1945, Allied aircraft dropped over 1.6 million tons of bombs on German soil. More than 60 cities were heavily damaged. At least 500,000 civilians were killed, 5 million homes destroyed, and 7 million people displaced. The British Royal Air Force flew over 364,000 sorties. The U.S. 8th and 15th Air Forces flew more than 1 million. Together, they transformed the very concept of modern warfare, proving that the sky itself could become a weapon. By the time Berlin fell, the Luftwaffe had virtually ceased to exist. Out of its 40,000 combat aircraft built during the war, fewer than 2,000 remained operational. Fuel reserves were gone. Airfields were craters. Factories once producing Messerschmitts and Heinkels now stood open to the wind. Twisted skeletons filled with silence. The human cost. The human toll went far beyond numbers. Entire generations grew up amid rubble. In the cities, children called Trümmerkinder Rubble kids played among broken walls and burned-out tanks. Mothers searched for sons who had never returned. Wives received letters marked vermisst, missing. Hospitals overflowed with the wounded and the homeless. Yet even among devastation, a strange calm took hold. The constant fear that had ruled the nights was gone. For the first time in years, people could sleep without the sound of sirens. One woman from Dresden later recalled, "When the bombers stopped coming, I realized I could finally hear my own heartbeat. But peace did not bring relief, only emptiness. The streets were silent, but silence now meant absence. Of fathers, homes, cities, meaning." The occupation and reckoning as Allied troops occupied Germany. The scale of destruction shocked even them. American soldiers driving through Cologne or Frankfurt saw cities that looked more like lunar landscapes than urban centers. In Berlin, the Soviet army found entire districts unrecognizable. The Reich Chancellery was a shattered tomb. The Tiergarten, once filled with greenery, was a wasteland of stumps and bomb craters. The Allies began to document everything: aerial surveys, photographs, damage reports. What they found was more than military devastation. It was the destruction of identity. The cities that once symbolized German culture, Hamburg's opera, Dresden's Zwinger Palace, Leipzig's universities, had been erased by the same hands that claimed to be fighting for civilization. Even within the Allied ranks, doubts began to surface. The British Air Staff, reviewing the results of area bombing, concluded that while it had crippled Germany's ability to fight, it had not decisively broken its spirit until the very end. The Americans, too, questioned whether industrial targets had justified such civilian losses. Churchill himself wrote in March 1945, shortly after Dresden, "The destruction of Dresden remains a serious query against the conduct of Allied bombing. The officers who waited for the German officers who had spent the war underground, those who had waited for silence. Surrender brought no peace. Many were captured in their bunkers, surrounded by maps, documents, and the burnt smell of wiring. Their war had been fought with headphones and coordinates, not rifles, yet they carried the same look of defeat. Some refused to speak. Others admitted what they had known all along, that the air war had been lost long before Berlin burned." A Luftwaffe radio officer later told interrogators, "We knew the bombers would come again. We only pretended to fight them. We were just measuring time until the end." Their silence was not just the absence of sound. It was the sound of realization, that they had been witnesses to the slow, methodical erasure of their own country. The sound that haunted the survivors. Even after the war, survivors spoke of hearing the bombers in their dreams. The low hum of engines, the rising thunder, the silence afterward. To the civilians, it became part of their identity, a trauma woven into memory. To the soldiers, it became the sound of inevitability, proof that even discipline and obedience could not defy the sky. And to the officers who once waited for the noise to stop, it became a paradox. They had wanted silence, but when it finally came, it was unbearable. When the dust settled, the war in the air left behind not just destruction, but a new kind of world, one defined by power from above. The German officers who had once ruled those skies were now prisoners, standing in open fields under the same heavens they once commanded. The hum of engines that had haunted them was gone, but the consequences of those years of thunder were only beginning to unfold. From rubble to realization. In the months following Germany's surrender, the Allies walked through the remains of cities they had reduced to ashes. In Hamburg, aerial photographs revealed neighborhoods so thoroughly erased that streets no longer existed on maps. In Dresden, the ruins of the Frauenkirche stood like a gravestone for an entire generation. But amid the devastation, something new began to emerge. Civilians cleared debris with their bare hands brick by brick. The Trümmerfrauen, the rubble women, became symbols of survival. They worked without complaint, often in silence, reshaping what was left into the beginnings of a future. For them, rebuilding was not about revenge or pride. It was about reclaiming humanity. Yet in every rebuilt street, the ghosts of the past remained. The outlines of burned buildings marked the memory of what once stood. Every time a hammer struck stone, people remembered the nights when the same streets had echoed with bombs instead. The moral reckoning, the Allied bombing campaign had achieved its military goals. But it also forced the world to confront a question that still lingers. Did the end justify the means? In post-war tribunals, the focus turned to German war crimes. Yet some voices, even among Allied nations, questioned the morality of the strategic bombing. The philosopher A.C. Grayling would later write, "The air war against Germany was not merely a military strategy. It was a test of humanity's ability to destroy in order to win." The architects of the campaign defended their choices. Air Chief Marshal Harris maintained until his death that area bombing had shortened the war and saved Allied lives by preventing an invasion that would have cost millions more. But historians and survivors disagreed. They pointed out that many of the cities targeted near the end of the war, Dresden, Würzburg, Hildesheim, had little military value left. For Germany, the bombings became a painful paradox. They were both a punishment for aggression and a tragedy shared by civilians who had little say in it. In the decades that followed, remembrance replaced rhetoric. Memorials rose not for victory, but for victims, on both sides of the sky. The birth of the jet age, ironically, out of the ashes of the war emerged a revolution in aviation. German research into jet propulsion, radar, and rocketry, once intended to turn the tide, became the foundation for the next era of human flight. The Allies captured and repurposed German technology, leading directly to the Cold War arms race. The same skies that had once been filled with bombers now held jet fighters, reconnaissance planes, and soon, nuclear bombers capable of annihilating entire continents. The lesson of the bombing campaigns, that air power could shape the fate of nations, became doctrine. From Korea to Vietnam, from Iraq to Ukraine, the echo of those engines still defines modern warfare. For the men who had once waited in bunkers for silence, the sound had simply changed form, from propellers to turbines, from bombs to missiles. Humanity had not escaped the shadow of the sky. It had merely made it faster. A city without sound in modern Berlin, the places once marked by war have become museums, parks, and memorials. Tourists stand where the Air Ministry once stood, now the German Finance Ministry, its concrete walls still bearing faint scars of shrapnel. At night, the city hums with life, traffic, and laughter. But beneath the rhythm of modern noise lies an invisible silence, the same silence the officers once prayed for, now finally real. And yet, for those who know the history, that silence still carries an echo, a memory of engines that returned again and again, until there was nothing left to burn. A silence that came not with peace, but with the end of everything. Epilogue. The silence. They feared. When German officers waited for silence, they never imagined what it would mean. To them, silence was survival, the brief reprieve before the next attack. But when silence finally came in May 1945, it was absolute. It was the silence of defeat, of surrender, of realization. They had waited for it for years, and when it arrived, it was worse than the bombs. The bombers always came back, one survivor said, until the day they didn't, and that was the day we lost everything. In the end, history remembers the bombers not just for what they destroyed, but for what they revealed. They showed that in the age of machines, war could outgrow the battlefield. It could reach into bedrooms, hospitals, churches, and hearts. It could make an entire nation listen to the same sound, the slow, growing hum of engines that meant life or death. For the German officers who waited underground, that sound became a rhythm of existence. For the Allied pilots, it was duty. For the civilians, it was terror. And yet all of them shared something no weapon could erase: the memory of endurance. The air war over Germany proved a dark truth of modern warfare, that courage and fear can exist on both sides of the same sky. It wasn't good against evil or heroes against villains. It was humanity wrestling with the power it had built, discovering that technology could make men into gods, but gods without mercy. The silence that finally came in May 1945 was not peace. It was exhaustion. It was the end of an era when the roar of engines had become the sound of fate. Out of that silence, a new world was born. One built from rubble. One that vowed never to let the sky burn like that again. But the lessons remain above us, invisible yet constant. Because every city that stands today, every light seen from an airplane window, owes something to those years when the night itself was on fire. And somewhere, in the hum of modern engines, in the distant echo of thunder above the clouds, the ghosts of those who once waited for silence are still listening. If this story moved you, don't forget to subscribe. And tell us which country or city you're watching from in the comments.